The two thanes were shouting again. It was always two thanes, and it was always about something that could be solved with a map and 10 minutes of quiet reason. Today it was troop levies for the winter campaign in the Pale. Thane Vignar Greymane of Whiterun, or what we held of its snowy plains, insisted his farms could not spare another man. Thane Torsten Firebeard of Dawnstar, whose hold was the damn objective, called him a milk drinker afraid of the frost. The voices echoed off the high stone ceiling of the Palace of the Kings, turning into a dull, angry roar that frayed the nerves. I stood by the fire pit, feeling the heat on my back. My name is Hror Redarm, and I am housecarl to Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak. It is my job to make sure the shouting does not become the only sound in this hall. It is my job to turn the roar back into words. Ulfric sat on his throne, flanked by the old banners of his ancestors. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched them, his face a mask of cold patience, but I knew him. I had served with him in the Great War long before he was the Jarl of Windhelm, long before the Bear of Markarth became his title and his burden. I saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. He was letting them exhaust their rage, but his own was building. If he had to intervene, it would be with a voice like a landslide. An order would be given, one thane would be humiliated, and I would spend the next week mending an alliance that was as fragile as ice in the spring thaw. That was not efficient. I pushed myself away from the fire. I walked toward them, my boots loud on the stone floor. The sound cut through their argument for a moment. Both thanes turned to look at me, their faces flushed with anger. "Thane Greymane," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was pitched to carry. "Your last report stated a surplus of nearly 300 bushels of wheat from the autumn harvest, even after the tithe." Vignar's eyes narrowed. "That is for my people. We do not know how long this winter will be." "It is," I agreed. "But the men you send will need to eat. Those bushels can be added to the campaign train. In exchange, Thane Firebeard, your hold will provide the timber for new shield walls at the Whiterun encampments. Your foresters are idle, and my reports say the Legion is testing the perimeter daily." Torsten puffed out his chest. "My timber for his wheat. He is sparing no men." "He is," I corrected him, keeping my tone flat. "He will send 50, not the 100 you asked for, but they will be his best hunters, men who can live off the land and move without a supply train for a week if needed. They are worth more than 100 farm boys who have never felt a Nord wind north of Whiterun. You get your soldiers. He keeps enough men to work his lands. The army gets fed. The Western Front gets reinforced. Or you can both keep shouting, and Jarl Ulfric can give an order you will both regret." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I did not look at the throne, but I could feel Ulfric's gaze on us. The silence stretched. Vignar Greymane grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. Torsten Firebeard, after a moment of theatrical glaring, gave a curt nod. "Fine," Torsten bit out. 50 hunters, and the grain." I nodded. "I will have the orders drawn up." They stomped off to separate corners of the hall. The crisis was over. I turned and met Ulfric's eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was all the thanks I needed. Galmar Stonefist, his hulking second in command, lumbered over and clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to make a lesser man stumble. "Damn fine work, Hror," he growled, a grin splitting his beard. "Like herding angry mammoths." "Just keeping the gears turning, Galmar," I said. He grunted and moved toward the throne to speak with Ulfric in low tones. I watched them for a moment. The great Jarl and his bear, the heart and the fist of the Stormcloak rebellion. And I was the bones, the structure that held it all together. I managed the logistics, the intelligence, the petitioners who clogged the hall from dawn till dusk. I was good at it, Every report, every map, every bushel of grain, and every steel ingot was a fact in my head. I could tell you the name of the blacksmith in Falkreath who forged the best arrowheads and the disposition of the Jarl of Morthal's housecarl toward the Empire. This was not just a war of swords and shouts. It was a war of numbers, of supplies, of knowing who to trust and who to watch. I was the one who watched. My belief in the cause was as solid as the stone beneath my feet. I had seen what the Empire had become, a stooped and broken thing licking the boots of the Thalmor. I had been at the signing of the White Gold Concordat. I had watched imperial legates who had fought and bled alongside us avert their eyes as the Aldmeri elves dictated the terms of our surrender. The banning of Talos worship was not a political compromise. It was a knife in the heart of every Nord in Skyrim. Ulfric was the only one who had the courage to say so, to act on it. What started in Markarth was not an atrocity, it was a necessity. And this war, this bloody, grinding war, was the only path back to a Skyrim that was truly ours. Ulfric was no tyrant. He was a commander, and a commander must be hard. It was my job to ensure his hardness was aimed at the enemy, not his own people. I made my way to the steward's alcove, a small space carved out of the wall near the kitchens. Flavius Salvius, the imperial steward who had served Ulfric's father and somehow managed to keep his position, was hunched over a ledger, his quill scratching away. He was a small, neat man, a stark contrast to the boisterous Nords who filled the palace. "The Thanes are placated," I said. Flavius did not look up. "For today, they will find something else to bellow about tomorrow. It is their nature." His voice was dry without inflection. "Draw up the orders," I told him. 50 hunters from Whiterun hold to the Pale camp. 300 bushels of wheat to the quartermaster there. A requisition for timber from Dawnstar's mills to be sent to Whiterun. Top priority. He finally looked up, his pale eyes blinking slowly. "The Whiterun contingent will be under strength. They will be effective. That is the difference. A difference you seem to be one of the few to appreciate, Housecarl," he said. He dipped his quill. "It will be done." I trusted Flavius, not because I thought he secretly supported the Stormcloaks. I knew for a fact he thought we were all suicidal fools, but because he was a creature of order. His loyalty was to the ledger, to the tidy columns of numbers and the smooth functioning of the palace bureaucracy. In his own way, he was as vital as Galmar. He was a gear, just like me, and the machine was working. For now, it was working perfectly. I left him to his scratching and walked the length of the hall, my hall. Every guard knew his post. Every petitioner was being heard, even if their complaints were about stolen chickens or loud neighbors. The great map of Skyrim on the wall was dotted with blue pins, each one a victory, a foothold, a step closer to solitude. The weight on my shoulders was immense, but it was a familiar weight. It was the weight of purpose. I felt strong enough to carry it. I was Hror Redarm, and I knew my job. The whole thing was a complex machine, and I was the master mechanic. Nothing could break as long as I was watching. I spent the rest of the day in the minutiae, a dispute over fishing rights in the Yorgrim River, a request from the blacksmith for more iron ore, which I knew we had in a forgotten cache behind the barracks, a quiet word with a stable boy who had been selling information about troop movements to a contact in the Blackbriar meadery. I did not have the boy flogged. I had him sent to the front lines in the Reach. He would learn the price of his treason in blood, not on his back. It was more effective. In the evening, I sat down with my own ledgers, the ones Flavius never saw. These were not about grain and timber, they were about people, a network of informants, sympathizers, and sources stretching across Skyrim. From the docks of Solitude to the corner clubs of Riften, I had eyes and ears. My most valuable asset was a Breton merchant in Markarth, a man named Roland Lenoir. He had no love for the Nords, but he hated the Silverblood family and their legion cronies more. For a steady supply of gold, he fed me information on legion patrols, Thalmor movements, and the political currents within the City of Stone. His information had saved a dozen Stormcloak patrols from ambush. It had allowed us to intercept 3 Imperial payroll shipments. Roland was careful, clever, and utterly reliable. He was the linchpin of our entire intelligence operation in the West. I was reviewing his latest report, a coded message tucked into a crate of smelted silver, when a young Stormcloak soldier approached my table. It was Stenvar Frostmantle, a lad from a good family full of fire and devotion to Ulfric. "Housecarl," he said, his voice tense. "A courier just arrived from the Reach. He rode 3 horses to death to get here." I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. "Where is he?" "With the Jarl." I stood up, my chair scraping on the stone. I walked quickly toward the throne room, Stenvar at my heels. The great hall was quieter now, most of the petitioners gone for the night. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the low murmur of Ulfric's voice from the dais. I stopped at the base of the steps. The courier was a boy, no older than 16, covered in mud and sweat, trembling with exhaustion. Ulfric held a small sealed scroll in his hand. Galmar stood beside him, his face like a thunderhead. Ulfric looked at me. His eyes were chips of ice. "Hror, your man in Markarth, Roland Lenoir." "What about him?" I asked, my own voice sounding distant. "He was taken," Ulfric said, his voice flat and hard. 2 days ago, the Thalmor. They found his ledgers, a list of names, payments, everything." He held up the scroll. "This is from our last remaining contact in the city, a barmaid at the Silver Inn. She says they tortured him for a day. Then they dragged him into the public square and burned him alive." The heat from the fire pit suddenly felt 1,000 miles away. Burned him. The Thalmor did not just kill, they made examples. Roland was not just dead, he was a message. My network in the Reach, my entire web of spies and sources built over 2 years of careful work, was not just compromised. It was gone, annihilated. Every name in that ledger was a dead man or woman walking. "The rest of them?" I managed to ask. "Hunted down," Galmar growled. "Every last one. The Thalmor are sweeping the city. They say a dozen traitors have been purged." I stood there, the stone floor seeming to tilt beneath me. I had recruited Roland. I had assured him he was safe. I had built the system that had just led him and a dozen others to their deaths. It was my system, my failure. "They want us to react," I said, the words coming out automatically, a strategist's assessment cutting through the shock. "They are baiting a trap. They expect a punitive raid. They will have the roads watched, an ambush waiting. Then we will give them a fight they will not expect," Galmar roared, slamming his fist on the arm of the throne. "We ride for Markarth. We will burn their damned embassy to the ground." "No," I said, my voice gaining strength. "That is what they want. We would be marching into a slaughter. We would lose 100 men for nothing." "Doing nothing is the same as losing," Galmar shot back. "I did not say do nothing," I replied, my eyes fixed on Ulfric. "I said do not do what they expect. We have lost the Reach for now. Our intelligence is blind. To send troops there now would be suicide. We need to consolidate, strengthen our position in Whiterun and the Pale, and we need to rebuild, quietly, slowly." Ulfric was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He looked at the map on the wall, at the city of Markarth, now a black hole in our network. The loss of Roland was more than just a strategic setback. He was a good man, a brave man in his own way, and I had sent him to his death. The thought was a stone in my chest. I had to swallow around it to speak. "Jarl," I said, Let me handle this. I will find new sources. It will take time, but it can be done. Ulfric finally looked away from the map and back at me. See that you do, Hror, he said. His voice was devoid of anger, which was somehow worse. It was the voice of a commander assessing a damaged asset. You have 1 month to give me eyes in Markarth again. 1 month. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the hall. Galmar gave me a look of pure disgust and followed him. The young courier was led away by Stenvar to get food and rest. I was alone, the first crack. Not in the rebellion, in me. The perfect machine had a broken gear. My competence, the thing I relied on, had failed. And people were dead because of it. I walked back to my table, the ledgers open, the list of names a testament to my failure. I sat down, but I did not look at them. I just stared into the fire, feeling the cold spread through me. Compensation. I had to compensate. I would work harder. I would be more careful. I would rebuild what was lost. The confidence was still there, a flickering ember in the cold dread. But now it had to be fed, it had to be protected. The work was no longer just about winning a war. It was about not failing again. And I did not know which was harder. The month Ulfric gave me was the longest of my life. Sleep became a luxury I could not afford. I spent my nights poring over old Imperial census records, merchant guild rosters, anything that could give me a name in Markarth that was not already in a Thalmor file. Every potential contact had to be vetted through 3 separate indirect channels. Every message was a risk. I used Khajiit caravans, traveling bards, even a company of pilgrims on their way to a forgotten shrine in the mountains. It was slow, frustrating work. For every promising lead, 2 more turned out to be dead ends, or worse, potential traps. During the day, I still had to run the palace. The thanes still shouted, the petitioners still pleaded, but my attention was fractured. My mind was always half in the reach, sifting through shadows and whispers. Flavius Salvius watched me, his expression unreadable. "You look unwell, Housecarl," he commented one afternoon as I was staring blankly at a supply manifest. "I am busy," I said, forcing my eyes to focus on the numbers. They swam before my eyes. "Indeed," he murmured and went back to his work. I started leaning more on Stenvar Frostmantle. The young soldier was eager to help, his devotion to the cause unmarred by failure. I gave him tasks I once would have handled myself, organizing the guard rotation, mediating minor disputes, compiling the daily reports for Ulfric. He performed them with brisk, unquestioning efficiency. He was a good soldier, but he lacked subtlety. He saw every problem as a nail to be hit with the hammer of Stormcloak authority. He had a Dunmer merchant flogged for short-changing a soldier by 2 septims. The merchant was almost certainly a spy for the Empire, but the public punishment stirred resentment in the Grey Quarter. It was a clumsy move. A year ago, I would have handled it quietly, decisively. Now I did not have the energy to do more than reprimand Stenvar, who looked at me with genuine confusion. "He was a traitor, Housecarl," Stenvar said, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Traitors deserve punishment." "There are different kinds of punishment, Stenvar," I told him, my voice weary. "And there are different kinds of battles. Not all of them are fought with swords." He did not understand. He saw the world in the bright, clear colors of his blue uniform. My world was becoming a landscape of grays. By the end of the month, I had a network. It was a pale shadow of what I had before. A disgruntled miner, a bitter temple acolyte, and a skooma-addicted innkeeper. They were unreliable, greedy, and frightened. But they were mine. They were eyes in Markarth. I presented my report to Ulfric. He read it in silence, his expression grim. "This is what you have given me?" he asked, tossing the report onto the table. "A drunk, a fanatic, and a coward." "They are what is left, Jarl," I said. They are a start. A weak start, Galmar grumbled from his position by the fire. Ulfric stared at me for a long moment. See that it improves, he said finally, and turned away. It was not an absolution. It was a stay of execution. I had compensated for my loss, but the repair was a crude patch, not a proper fix. The machine was running again, but it made a new, ugly noise, a grinding sound that only I could hear. The war ground on into the heart of winter. The snows fell thick and heavy, choking the passes and slowing the movement of troops on both sides. It became a war of skirmishes and supply lines, and supplies were my domain. Or they had been. We had a large camp in the Rift, preparing for a spring offensive toward Fort Greenwall. They were running low on everything: weapons, armor, food. I spent a week planning a major supply convoy. I charted a route through the southern foothills using old smugglers' trails and forgotten hunting paths. It was longer, more difficult terrain, but it avoided every known Legion patrol route. The plan was meticulous, it was safe, it was my work, and I was proud of it. I presented it to Ulfric and Galmar in the war room. Ulfric studied the map, tracing the proposed route with a finger. He nodded slowly. "It is a good plan, Hror," he said, "well thought out." "It is a coward's plan," Galmar spat. He stabbed a thick finger at the main road on the map, the one that ran straight from Shore's Stone to the Rift Camp. "We take this road, a full company of my best men as an escort. We march in broad daylight. Let the Imperials see the strength of the Stormcloaks. Let them see we are not afraid to use the roads they claim to control." "That road is patrolled twice a day by Legion cavalry," I said, my voice tight. "They have watchers on every ridge. It is an invitation for an ambush." "Let them try," Galmar grinned, his teeth yellow in the torchlight. "My boys could use the exercise." "We are not risking a winter's worth of supplies for exercise," I shot back. "My only concern is getting the convoy to the camp intact." "My concern is winning this damn war," Galmar roared, "and you do not win by slinking through the shadows like a thief." I looked to Ulfric. This was his decision. The commander, the Jarl. He had to see the logic, the sense in my plan. He had to see the reckless pride in Galmar's. But Ulfric's eyes were distant again. He was not looking at the map anymore. He was looking at some internal horizon, a vision of a glorious victory that had little to do with the cold realities of logistics. "A show of strength has its own value, Hror," Ulfric said quietly. "We need to remind the people that we are not just rebels hiding in the hills. We are an army." He looked at Galmar. "Take the main road, but take 200 men, not 100. I want that convoy to look like a moving fortress." Galmar's grin widened. "Aye, Jarl, it will be done." I stood there, the map feeling like a useless piece of paper in my hand. He had chosen Galmar's pride over my reason. He had chosen the symbol over the substance. My authority in this room, in my own area of expertise, had just been nullified. I did not argue further. I just rolled up the map and walked out of the room. There was nothing more to say. I had been overruled. The convoy set out 2 days later, a long line of wagons and soldiers marching proudly down the snow-covered road. I watched it go from the battlements of the palace, a knot of dread in my stomach. 4 days later, a single scout, wounded and half-frozen, stumbled into the city. The convoy had been ambushed near Fort Greenwall. A massive Legion force, complete with battle mages and archers, had been waiting for them. They had sprung the trap perfectly. Galmar's men had fought like lions, but they had been outnumbered and outmaneuvered. We lost over 100 men. We lost half the wagons, including all the new steel armor and most of the medical supplies. Galmar himself had made it back to the Rift Camp with the remnants of his force, but it was a bloody, humiliating defeat. When the news reached Ulfric, he did not rage. He did not shout. He went into the war room and stood before the great map for hours, saying nothing. Galmar was not reprimanded, no one was. No, the failure was simply absorbed into the grim calculus of the war. But I felt it as a personal blow. I had been right, and being right had changed nothing. My competence was worthless if it was ignored. I had tried to prevent a disaster, and my counsel had been dismissed. The grinding sound in the machine was louder now. A gear had slipped, my gear. The second loss was not a person or a resource. It was a piece of my standing, a piece of my purpose. I was still the housecarl, I still had my duties. But I was no longer the trusted advisor. I was just another functionary. The bitterness of it settled deep in my bones, a cold that the fire in the great hall could not touch. It was that same week that the street brawl happened. It was late, and I was walking back to my quarters from the market, my mind still chewing on the convoy disaster. A group of drunken Nords were harassing a family of Dunmer, shouting insults, calling them imperial spies. It was the usual ugliness, fueled by cheap ale and the endless tension of the war. Normally I would have waded in, my voice like a whip, and scattered them all with a few sharp commands, but I was tired. The cold had seeped into my bones, and a part of me, a dark and ugly part, did not care. Let them shout. It was Ulfric's city. Let him deal with its ugliness. But the shouting turned to shoving. One of the Nords drew a knife. The Dunmer father tried to shield his wife and child. I could not just stand there. I was still a housecarl. I moved in, my hand on the hilt of my own blade. "Enough!" I bellowed. The Nords turned, surprised. One of them, a big stupid brute with a braided beard, sneered at me. "This ain't your business, old man." "This is the Jarl's city," I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. "And you are disturbing his peace. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown in the cells." For a moment I thought they would back down, but they were too drunk, too full of hate. The big one lunged at me. I was ready for him. I sidestepped and brought the pommel of my sword down on his wrist. He howled and dropped his knife, but I had not seen his friend, a smaller, quicker man who came at me from the side. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my left thigh. I looked down and saw the hilt of a dagger sticking out of my leg. The world seemed to go fuzzy for a second. I staggered back, a roar of pure rage building in my chest. I drew my sword, the real blade this time, and the remaining Nords, suddenly sobered by the sight of drawn steel and a wounded housecarl, scattered and fled into the night. The Dunmer family had already vanished. I was alone in the alley, the dagger in my leg, a shocking, obscene thing. I pulled it out, gritting my teeth against the wave of pain. The blade was thin and jagged, a gutting knife, not a clean wound. I limped back to the palace, leaving a trail of blood on the snow. The healer, an old woman named Helga, tutted over the wound. "This is a bad one, Hror," she said, cleaning it with a foul-smelling poultice. "It is deep, and the blade was dirty. It will be slow to heal." She was right. It was not slow to heal. It never healed properly. The wound festered for weeks. The fever that came with it nearly killed me. When I was finally able to walk again, it was with a pronounced limp. A constant throbbing pain settled into my leg, a permanent reminder of that night. I could no longer stand for hours in the Great Hall. I could no longer pace the battlements. Walking from one end of the palace to the other was an exercise in endurance. The pain was a constant distraction. It was a thief, stealing my concentration, my patience, my energy. This was the third loss. My own body had betrayed me. I had to delegate more and more of my duties to Stenvar Frostmantle. He was Ulfric's shadow now, his right hand for all the practical matters of the court. I was becoming a figurehead, the old housecarl who sat by the fire and offered advice that was rarely taken. The work was no longer about managing the court. It was about managing my own decline. I had to carefully husband my strength, to choose which tasks were worth the pain and which I had to let go. The workarounds were becoming my life. I was a patchwork of compensations, a man holding himself together with sheer will. But the will was fraying. The machine was not just grinding now, it was starting to break down. And I was trapped inside it. The pain in my leg became the rhythm of my days. A dull ache when I sat, a sharp throb when I walked. It wore me down, sandpapering my nerves until they were raw. My focus, once sharp enough to cut glass, became clouded. I started making mistakes, small ones at first, but they accumulated like snowdrifts against a wall. I misread a quartermaster's report from the pail. The numbers for salted fish and steel ingots were right next to each other on the cramped parchment. My eyes, tired and strained in the dim light of my alcove, swapped them. I dispatched a shipment of 500 salted hake to Dawnstar and a wagon load of armor plating to the fishing camp at Anga's mill. Dawnstar, a city built on fishing, had no use for more fish. The men at Anga's mill, who were fending off wolf packs with sharpened sticks, had no use for plate mail they could not eat. It was a ridiculous, humiliating error. The couriers who brought the news back were trying not to laugh. Galmar Stonefist did not bother to hide it. He stood in the middle of the great hall, his voice booming. "Sending fish to Dawnstar, Roar? Are you trying to drown them in it? Perhaps next you will send a shipment of snow to Winterhold." The men around him chuckled. "Getting soft, old man? Maybe you should leave the planning to those who can still read." I stood there, my face burning. I had no defense. It was a stupid mistake, the kind a raw recruit would not make. I looked toward the throne, but Ulfric was not looking at me. He was in conversation with a thane from Riften, his face impassive. He had either not heard or did not care. I did not know which was worse. I turned and walked away, my limp more pronounced than ever, the sound of Galmar's laughter following me like a pack of dogs. My world was shrinking. The great map of Skyrim, once a field of strategic possibilities, was now just a tapestry of potential failures. Every pin represented a camp that needed something I might forget to send, a patrol that might walk into an ambush I failed to foresee. I retreated further into the palace, my duties becoming smaller, more manageable. I oversaw the kitchens. I managed the palace guard rota. I listened to the endless petty complaints of the Windhelm citizenry. These were tasks I could handle. They required patience, not sharp intellect or physical stamina. But even as my world shrank, the war outside grew larger and stranger. The news from the west was of dragons, not just rumors, but confirmed sightings. A village burned near Rorikstead, a watchtower destroyed outside Markarth. Helgen, a town I knew well, wiped from the face of the earth. People were terrified. They flocked to the cities, bringing tales of black wings and skies on fire. I expected Ulfric to seize on this. A new enemy, a threat to all of Skyrim, a chance to unite the holds, to put aside the war with the Legion and face the true danger. He was the Dovahkiin, the Dragonborn, or so the Greybeards had named him. This was his moment. But he did nothing. He dismissed the reports as imperial propaganda or mass hysteria. When a petitioner, a farmer whose entire herd had been incinerated, fell to his knees before the throne and begged the Jarl to do something, Ulfric just stared at him with cold, empty eyes. "The dragons are a distraction," Ulfric said, his voice flat. "The true enemy is the Empire. They would see Skyrim weakened, divided. They would see us chase shadows while their legion tightens its grip. Our war is here. Our enemy is Tullius. When he is defeated, when the High King's crown is on my head, then I will deal with the dragons." The farmer stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He was dragged away, weeping. I watched it happen, a cold dread creeping into my heart. This was not the commander I had known. The Ulfric I served in the Great War would have seen the strategic reality. A new, powerful force on the field changes everything. You adapt or you die. But this Ulfric, the Jarl of Windhelm, could not adapt. He was locked on a single path, a single goal, the throne. Everything else, the dragons, the suffering of the people, the very real possibility of the world ending, was just a distraction. His vision had narrowed until it could only see the crown. He became obsessed with slights. Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone of Morthal sent a gift of alchemical reagents, a traditional sign of respect. But the Nirnroot was last year's crop, slightly withered. Ulfric took it as a mortal insult. He spent a week dictating furious letters to Morthal, accusing Idgrod of secretly siding with the Empire. I tried to intervene. "Jarl," I said, catching him alone in the war room. "She is a mystic, not a politician. She probably did not even notice. It means nothing." "It means everything," he snapped, his eyes blazing. "It means she does not respect me. It means she thinks I am a provincial upstart who can be placated with withered leaves. She will learn respect." His paranoia grew like a cancer. He saw spies everywhere. He ordered the arrest of a dozen Dunmer in the Grey Quarter on suspicion of collaborating with the Empire. There was no evidence, just the whispers of a skooma addict trying to curry favor. Steenvar Frostmantle carried out the order with grim satisfaction. The Grey Quarter, which had been sullenly neutral, was now openly hostile. We had created a nest of enemies within our own walls. I argued against it. I presented Flavius Salvius's meticulous records, which showed the arrested elves were simple laborers and merchants with no imperial connections. Ulfric waved the ledgers away without looking at them. "Your imperial steward would defend them, would he not?" Ulfric sneered. "Perhaps I should be watching him more closely. Perhaps I should be watching you more closely, Hror. You have grown soft. Too much time with your books and not enough with your sword." The words hit me like a physical blow. He did not trust me. He saw my caution as weakness, my reason as treachery. The man I had dedicated my life to serving looked at me and saw an enemy. The final failure was not long in coming. A company of soldiers from the Falkreath region had deserted the Legion and wanted to join us. Their captain, a charismatic Nord named Brand Alhrafn, came to Windhelm to pledge his loyalty. It was a major coup, a sign that the Legion's morale was cracking. Ulfric was ecstatic. He tasked me with vetting the man. "I want to know everything about him, Roar," Ulfric commanded. "His family, his service record, his reasons for turning his cloak. I will not have a viper in our midst." It was a chance to redeem myself, a chance to prove I was still useful. I threw myself into the task, but my mind was a fog of pain and exhaustion. My leg ached relentlessly. The words in the reports blurred together. I sent queries to our contacts in Falkreath, but the replies were slow in coming. Brand was charming. He told all the right stories of imperial corruption and Thalmor arrogance. He spent his evenings in the barracks, winning over our soldiers with tales of his exploits. Galmar loved him. Stenvar idolized him. I had a feeling, a deep instinctual wrongness about the man. His stories were too perfect, his hatred of the Empire too theatrical. But I had no proof. My informants in Falkreath could find nothing amiss. His service record was clean. My gut told me he was a liar, but my evidence, my facts, said he was a hero. And I no longer trusted my gut. My gut was tired and sore and full of doubt. I went to Ulfric. "I can find no reason to suspect him," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He appears to be what he says he is." "Good," Ulfric said, clapping Brand on the shoulder. The captain was given command of his own company, reinforced with some of our best men. They were sent to the front lines in the Reach, to a critical pass we had just taken. 2 weeks later, the news came. Captain Brand had opened the gates of the fortress to a Legion detachment. He and his original company had rejoined the Empire. The Stormcloak soldiers we had given him were all slaughtered or captured. The pass was lost. The entire Western Front was in danger of collapsing. It was a disaster on a scale that made the convoy ambush look like a minor skirmish. I stood before the throne. Galmar was there, his face a mask of cold fury. Stenvar was there, his eyes full of disillusionment. Ulfric sat, his hands gripping the arms of his throne. I expected him to rage, to have me executed on the spot. I almost wished he would. But he was quiet. He just looked at me, a long, empty stare. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no disappointment. There was nothing. It was the look you give a tool that has broken in your hand. A chair with a cracked leg, something that is no longer useful. "Get out," he said. The words were a whisper. They were the most brutal blow he had ever landed. I turned and walked out of the throne room. My limp was heavy, each step an agony. I did not go to my quarters. I went to the great hall, the place that had been my world. It was full of shouting thanes and desperate petitioners, but I did not see them. I was a ghost. My title was gone. My purpose was gone. The machine had finally, irrevocably broken, and I was just a discarded part left to rust in the corner. My title remained. I was still Roar Redarm, Housecarl. A cruel irony, a title with no duties, a name with no meaning. Stenvar Frostmantle was the true Housecarl now. He stood where I used to stand, his young face set in a permanent frown of concentration as he tried to manage the chaos I once tamed. He was not good at it. He had the energy, but not the experience. He gave orders that were contradictory. He promised resources we did not have. The shouting in the hall grew louder each day. I spent my time sitting by the main fire pit, a fixture as permanent and as useless as the ancient soot-stained banners overhead. The warmth did little to touch the cold that had settled in my marrow. My leg was a constant grinding agony, a physical manifestation of my failure. Flavius the steward would sometimes bring me a cup of mulled wine, his face a careful mask of neutrality. He never spoke of my fall. He did not need to. We would sit in silence, the scratching of his quill the only sound between us. From my seat by the fire I watched. I watched Ulfric. The war had taken its toll, but it was more than that. He was not just a weary commander, he was a man consumed. The dream of a free Skyrim had been whittled down to a single sharp point: his crown. He no longer spoke of the people, of justice, of Talos. He spoke of the moot. He spoke of his right. He spoke of his destiny. He would sit on his throne for hours, not moving, his eyes fixed on the far wall as if he could see the white gold tower of Cyrodiil and his own reflection in its stones. Petitioners would approach, their voices trembling as they spoke of lost sons, of blighted fields, of the dragon that was seen circling the peaks near Windhelm just last week. Ulfric would not respond. His gaze would remain distant, unfocused. After a moment, Galmar or Stenvar would step in and dismiss them. "The Jarl is meditating on the war effort," they would say. "He cannot be troubled with such minor matters." The tyranny of Ulfric Stormcloak was not in his shout, not in his orders, it was in his silence. It was in the vast, cold distance between the man on the throne and the people he claimed to be liberating. He had built a wall of righteousness around himself, and behind it, he was slowly starving. I watched the city reflect its Jarl. The guards on the street became more brutal. Any Dunmer found outside the Grey Quarter after dark was beaten and thrown in the cells. Supplies that were meant for the citizenry were diverted to the barracks without explanation. A cult of personality was hardening around Ulfric. To question the war, to even express weariness, was to be a traitor. Young soldiers like Stenvar spoke of Ulfric in hushed, reverent tones as if he were a god. They did not see the hollowed-out man on the throne. They saw the legend. They saw the Bear of Markarth. They saw the future High King. I saw a man who had sacrificed his kingdom to win a crown. I saw the waste. I saw the opportunities squandered. When news came that Jarl Balgruuf of Whiterun was finally considering an alliance with the Legion, I knew it was a failure of our making. I knew Balgruuf. He was a true Nord, a pragmatist who cared only for his people. He could have been won over. A year ago, I would have been in his court, speaking to him not as a soldier, but as a fellow Nord. I would have found common ground. I would have built a bridge. But Ulfric had sent Galmar, who had tried to bully him into submission, and so Whiterun, the key to the whole of Skyrim, was lost to us. I watched the blue pins on the great map being replaced by red ones, and I felt nothing but a dull, empty ache. The dragons were no longer a rumor. They were a fact of life. Their shadows passed over Windhelm. Their roars echoed from the throat of the world. Yet Ulfric remained unmoved. The dragon crisis, the single greatest threat to face Tamriel since the Oblivion crisis, was to him a secondary concern. His obsession had blinded him to the apocalypse gathering on his doorstep. The psychology of a tyrant, I realized, was not about the love of power. It was about the fear of losing one's own story. Ulfric's story was that he was the liberator of Skyrim, the true High King. He could not allow any other story, even one written in fire across the sky, to be more important. He was a prisoner of his own legend. And I was a prisoner in his court, a ghost at the feast. My days bled into one another, each one the same. Wake, limp to the great hall, sit, watch. Feel the pain in my leg, and then limp back to my cold room. I was no longer a gear in the machine. I was a witness to its slow, grinding collapse. One afternoon, the shouting started again. It was two minor thanes this time, one from a small village in the mountains, the other from a logging camp by the river. Their argument was about stolen livestock, a feud that had been simmering for generations. It was a petty, insignificant squabble, but their voices were loud, full of self-righteous anger. They stood in the center of the hall, their faces red, their hands on their swords. The court was a mess. Petitioners huddled in corners, ignored. Guards gambled openly with dice. The air was thick with the smell of stale ale and despair. Ulfric was on his throne, but he might as well have been in Sovngarde. He was staring at the tips of his own boots, his face a blank canvas. Galmar was gone, leading a raid in the south. Stenvar was trying to deal with a crisis at the barracks. No one was in control. I sat by the fire, watching the two thanes. I knew their feud. I knew the history of it. I knew the grazing rights of their lands by heart. I knew the bloodlines of the stolen cattle. I knew exactly what needed to be said to end the argument, to give both men a way to back down without losing face. It would take 5 minutes, 10 sentences. I had done it 100 times before. I pushed myself up from my chair, the pain in my leg a lance of white-hot fire. I took a step forward. The two thanes paused their shouting and looked at me, surprised to see the old ghost move. The whole hall seemed to quiet down for a moment. They were waiting. They were expecting the old roar, the one who could cut through the rage with a few quiet words of reason. I opened my mouth to speak. The words were there, lined up in my mind, precise and effective. But they would not come out. My throat was tight. A wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning washed over me. What was the point? What would it change? The argument would end, but another would begin tomorrow. The machine was broken. One small gear turning would not fix it. I closed my mouth. I just stood there in the middle of the hall, the silence stretching. The thanes looked at me, then at each other, confused. Then slowly they started shouting again. I turned away, the fire in my leg turning into a dull, familiar ache. I limped back to my chair and sat down. I was just another shadow in a cold hall, watching the embers of a dying fire. The pain in my leg was the only thing that felt real.